Assume everyone can hear me. Welcome. I can't tell you how much I appreciate being here. I'm Richard Hamermesh. I'm the one who's been sending you all these emails. I don't apologize because I'm thrilled that you're all here and the technology is working. Today's session, Cracking the Data Aggregation Problem, is part of one of the work streams that we have at the Kraft Precision Medicine Accelerator dealing with data and analytics. There's other work we're doing. Most of you have been to some of the Kraft events already at the business school. And one of the great things about this HBX format is you don't have to get on a plane and everyone, make it here. And we see people from Santa Monica and Mountain View and all over Atlanta. It's great that we have everyone here this way. So I thank you. The other great thing about this format is, for me, it feels like I'm right in an HBS classroom. Now, that's great because it means that I don't plan on doing most of the talking. This will be a discussion methodology, and I look forward to that. Probably most of you have experienced case method. If you haven't, you'll get the hang of it real soon. And basically, everyone's welcome to participate. So just real quickly, do we have the slides up, please? So our objectives: to address the fundamental issues of data aggregation, sharing, and analytics in the precision medicine space. And you've read the case and you can see how front and center that is. How do you get the right questions asked? Where do you find the data? What's the appropriate analytics? In addition to the case study, which we'll be doing for about the first 50 minutes here, we have Gabriel Eichler, who I'll introduce in a second. We have been updating our data landscape and our analytics landscape. So there'll be some information sharing as well. He'll do that in discussion mode, but we just don't want to ask questions. We also want to give some hints on some of the answers here. You've seen the schedule, and what we're going to start with is the case discussion. If you could show, Paul Giusti is here, president of the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. After a period of our discussion, Paul will come up. He'll comment on what he's heard and his lessons learned, where he's at on this, and we'll have time for Q&A at that point. After that, Kathy Giusti, my co-chair with the Kraft Precision Medicine Accelerator at Harvard Business School, will put this in a broader perspective of where it fits into our whole effort to try to catalyze and accelerate progress in precision medicine. And finally, Gabriel Eichler, gentleman on our left, heads our work stream on data and analytics, and he's been working on updating our data landscape that he'll share and creating our first analytics landscape. So that's the program as we have it laid out. So everyone got the case and read it? You can nod, okay? And even if you don't nod, you could be called on anyway. So we're going to get started, and for those who went to Harvard Business School, you can't do a case discussion with the faculty members' jacket on. So I've got that off, and you also know we cold call. And Krishna knows that, right? Because you were there, you've been there and done that, right? Deja vu all over again, right? So
usually I try and sit in the back of the classroom.
Yeah, Krishna, you're front.
Can't do that.
You're front and center. It's not the best place to sit when we're starting a class. But Krishna, just to get us started here, if you could, as I read the case, the MMRF has sort of been at this for 20 years now, and trying different approaches. We read the history of it, and now they're at this point with this Answer Fund. And I guess my question is, I'd like to get your views on it, and then hit your button if you want to chime in. What's the problems what problem are they trying to solve here? And I don't mean high risk or the immediate, but why are they doing this? It's a big expenditure of money, consultants, people. Why are they doing this in your view? What problems are they trying to solve?
So, I mean, yeah, there's kind of the initial, read of the case where it's, what they're trying to solve is these fundamental issues in multiple myeloma. What are the big questions? But if I were to think of it from the MMRF perspective, to me, the issue, or at least one of the big issues, is that there's $40 million or so that have gone into creating this data set of Compass, and it doesn't sound like there's been a lot of real results yet from it for the multiple myeloma community. And I suppose what I see in the context of the Answer Fund is trying to figure out how to get, well, one, I mean, if I was to be really direct about it, it's like, how do we make sure that $40 million, wasn't wasted? That's a huge amount of money for a data set that should be really valuable.
Christian, if I could just ask, and that's my prerogative, of course, is to ask, where did that $40 million come from?
Seemed like it came from some folks in the community. I'm sure that MMRF put some of it in. Sounds like there were some pharma entities around the table.
Yeah, and who? I mean, that's a lot of money. $40 million. Who? I mean, they're just running a nonprofit. Where did that? It's not in the case, but where does the money come from?
Anyone? I assume that's coming from pharma companies and donors, people who might have had
and big donors or little donors. Do you think they collected that money in $5 contributions at the at the bake sale?
Yeah, probably a few big
big check
for something like that.
And they may have this type of question like, what's happened with my $1 million check or whatever. Yeah. So you think that's sort of why they're doing this, is that they've got this $40 million out there. And we'll open it up to other underlying reasons. And I guess I could also ask Krishna, does it surprise you that after collecting this magnificent database, they still aren't seeing? Or, yeah, that's the way it goes. Aw, shucks.
I feel like probably everybody around the table has lived through some variant of this where, there's some underlying thing that seems like if we created this thing, if we build it, then they will come. And then you build it, and then folks aren't coming. The term of art that I sometimes hear in the tech circles is, kind of this thing called the stack fallacy, where it's like, if you build some underlying platform, then it always seems like, well, we've done the hard thing, and now the next thing on top of it should be really easy. So it'd be like, if I built a database, then maybe I just assume that building applications on top of that database should be easy. But then the reality is it's often sometimes easier to start with the problem and then figure out the rest of the infrastructure. But that's to me kind of how I read it, is that this is something that we've all been through, of creating something that seems like it should enable a lot of stuff, and then maybe just that last bit always seems like it's missing.
Cool.
Yeah.
Lee, I see, and I want to show I'm equal opportunity here on the wings here, so please.
It seems to me like this group was swimming upstream against all the infrastructure that's in an academic center, and all of promotion, all of making your name in academics is finding a discovery, and that doesn't encourage collaboration. So people are hoarding information, they're hoarding what they're doing, they're not willing to share it because they lose their chance to gain individual recognition, which is critical in academic medicine to promotion or tenure.
So, so when you read in there, Lee, that that some of the centers would access the tissue or the data and then don't share what they found until after their publication is out, is that, well, I guess two ways of wording it, is that disturbing to you and or surprising to you?
It's not surprising, it is disturbing. I mean, those are the incentives and the systems that those folks work in, so they are responding exactly as they should, given the incentives that are there. but it's not an incentive that gets us to faster answers.
So AMCs, maybe don't share is how I'll word it. And the specific examples in the case are that they use the tissue that the consortium's put together, and then they go their merry way until the publications happen with the first and last. We have people from academic medical centers here. Is this offensive to you or well described? Brian, press your button here. Are you offended or you recognize it all too well?
No, I think I recognize the comment, and I certainly see those incentives every day. That being said, I mean, you read the case, and it's kind of the opposite problem. There's all this data freely available for anyone to make a discovery that could make your academic career, and nobody wants to access it. So I'm not sure that that's the specific issue that's going on here. I think some of I do think it's a problem, though, so I will co-sign that.
Yeah, but listen, you've raised something that I hadn't really thought about that much. You're saying, hold it, academics are, as Lee said, incentivized to write publications. And as any researcher knows, the upfront piece is to create the database, right? And then from that, you're saying, here's a great database, and it's not being used. What's your explanation of that? I mean, why aren't you at the Farber? Why aren't people from MSK, the Farber, wherever, UCLA, clamoring to use this to get their publications?
Well, I don't know specifically. I guess I don't have enough content knowledge about multiple myeloma to actually answer that question. But I'll say that I built a big glioblastoma database, and then, there wasn't really questions to. I built the database thinking that, of course, if we had the data, we'd make all sorts of insights. But then at the end of the day, what question was it going to answer? And I'm not sure that we built the data first before we had the question. And I'm not sure that the data was fit for purpose for answering some of the questions that we had. Now I think it's useful for lots of other things in terms of clinical trial design, this kind of so-called real-world evidence, and kind of creating expectations of outcomes and those kind of things. So I think there's use of the data. But, I think there's a little bit of more of a leap of faith where we think that we just break down all the walls, put all the data together, and then all of a sudden insights are going to happen from the data. It's not necessary. I mean, that's testable. And so I'd say one of the major issues kind of facing MMRF and being responsive to funders is that funders want to see what their money is going to, but the best use of money from foundations or government is largely useful, and there may not be an answer that comes out of it. So, if we knew if collecting this data was going to be useful directly, and we knew that it was going to be useful, there'd probably be a lot more incentives.
I mean, it would help if we could anticipate all the questions. Devin, you've been hanging on that button here, so I'll give you a shot here. Okay.
I just keep pressing it and pressing it.
Yeah, I saw. I see all up here.
Yeah, I think the piece that no one has brought up yet is that the efforts made to crowdsource the questions that were of most interest to the patients. It wasn't that there wasn't research going on in multiple myeloma. There was. It's not that there wasn't data out there. There was. But the data was siloed. It wasn't necessarily all being brought to the key questions. And the key questions that were most important to patients were not necessarily being addressed.
So you point out that the Answer Fund crowdsourcing of the questions, but is implicit in that the academic researchers didn't know the right questions? Or, I look at, there's this exhibit here with all these abstracts. I'm not the science person here, but there are a lot of big words there.
Yeah. I'm not the science person either. They are really big words. It's not unusual, actually, for academics to be focused on really interesting science questions. It's not like those questions are not worth answering, but they're not necessarily the questions that are of most import to patients who have been diagnosed with the disease, and the questions that they face and the decisions that they have to make to maximize their potential.
Got it. Sudhir?
Yeah, just on that subject, I think there's a number of different stakeholders in the entire community,
Yeah.
and when it comes to research and clinical initiatives, there's, the patient's likely an underrepresented group there as far as who gets to drive what research is done. So a lot of that is driven by, academia, physicians, and industry and pharmaceutical companies. So I think part of the beauty of the approach of the Answer Fund is really bringing the patient perspective to the forefront, and saying, what are really the questions that they want answered.
Sudhir, you have been involved with the Kraft Accelerator really from the beginning. One thing I haven't heard anyone say is that why the Answer Fund, at least my reading of it, is that even with this great $40 million data set, there isn't enough data to answer the questions. Is that a fair read, or is that just sort of my hang up here? Well, Larry, I'll give you it. You want to answer? I can go to Larry if you want to.
Just a quick,
Sure.
quick point on that. I think others have touched on it, but if you start with the questions, by different stakeholder, and then lead to what are you going to build, whether it be a study design, a database, what functionality is built in, I think it makes it easier to right size it for answering those questions, because the answer to that is it depends on question, right? You can certainly answer a number of different interesting questions with the current data set, but there's also some tough ones that you need, a larger N to really get at.
So the issue here is that the N isn't big enough.
I think in some cases it's what data has been collected. In some cases maybe it's the N. And I think in some cases there's no issues. You can answer questions.
Right.
It's just a matter of what we're going after.
Larry, you still want to get in, or is it what Steve's already covered? Go ahead.
I'd love to. So
And I'll get you next, Chris.
As an academic researcher who works on multiple myeloma, I just wanted to add that a lot of people are actually using the data. I can't remember the last several years, all our papers have used part of the data. It's just a matter of which questions you're asking and how you're incorporating it into those questions. As for the, I will tell you that one of the issues with using the data, the size is great. In fact, it's an extremely unique database, and it allowed us, for the project that we did for the Answer Fund, we wouldn't be able to even ask that question without any other database. And so it's been extremely important that way. There always could be some room for more, of course.
Right.
No one denies that. But I do also think we have to consider that the data is dynamic in that, we're looking at patients, and follow-up is really the key here, talking about following up patients for at least 8 years. And many of the patients are still, relatively early on in this process. And so I'll give you an example of, we published a paper using Compass data last fall, and I did an analysis yesterday of with the same question.
Yes.
And now that the data is more mature, I get a bit of a different answer. Actually, I like the answer I got yesterday better than what we published
the one you had
6 months
before.
ago, unfortunately.
But it is interesting that
there are
Go ahead.
these opportunities exist, and so some of it's been, you will see more, I believe,
Right.
of people asking some of these bigger questions as the data matures a little bit. But we've been using it.
So there is that issue, and just going back to this thing on the data first or the question first. It's always so hard to anticipate what questions may arise in the future. Chris, did you still want to add something?
Also, we have to, I think, have a realistic expectation of what the data yields, and also kind of where we are with regard to the field of myeloma. I'm not a myeloma doc, but my sense is, myeloma is not thought to be like a targeted mutation-driven cancer the way we think of lung cancer or even BRAF and melanoma, for example. So, there are not specific mutations that we've identified in melanoma which are causative that I know of to date. Maybe some of the myeloma experts tell me that. So, you almost have to kind of you have to do kind of those, first level analysis before you can even do the second level analysis, which is, well, how do they respond on treatment? Because a lot of these treatments, again, are not targeted treatment therapies. So it's not that same linear progression of understanding of mutations the way that we do it in lung cancer. So, Now, I think the expectations in some ways are a little bit unrealistic. I mean, understanding what the resistance mechanisms to third-line homologous treatment are in some ways kind of way out of the reach if we haven't done the baseline work yet.
Now, you mentioned lung. I mean, we talked about this data aggregation, misaligned incentives. Do you think this is unique to myeloma or to these heterogeneous smaller cancers? Or is this data aggregation problem, getting the right questions up there, sort of a cancer-wide issue?
Well, I guess it's different depending on the cancer, because in lung we know there are causative mutations which are driver mutations and therefore treatable.
Sure.
And then some resistance, and then you figure out what the resistance mutations are, and
Right.
then these kind of analyses of first, second, and third line patients make a lot of sense.
Okay.
But in my we've traditionally don't understand what the driver mutations are, if there are any. We don't have treatments for driver mutations, and therefore, you know, it's a very different cancer to approach from a genomic standpoint than I think lung is. I'd love to hear from the myeloma experts on that.
Great. Mark, did you want to respond?
Yeah.
If you could respond directly, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, in terms of the data issues, it's not just the data heterogeneity, but there are other aspects of heterogeneity that really impact the size of the sample that we're using. There's treatment heterogeneity. How many of these patients are being treated on a protocol so that we can actually compare? And then there's underlying heterogeneity of the disease itself, given that we don't understand necessarily the causes. And so all of that contributes to smaller sample than would be evident by 1,000. And I'd also just mention that that's a tiny fraction of the number of patients with melanoma. I'm sorry, with myeloma. That we're really only getting a tiny fraction. We, you know, obviously you'd love to get all of the patients diagnosed and all the data, and then you'd have a data set that you could really work with.
Well, and this sort of gets back to that this archipelago of data that gets mentioned. If they could put up the slide I have, archipelago, okay. If you could put up the slide I have of the disturbing facts one that I had, and then Marty, I will go to you. Do you know the slide I'm referring to, please? So is that up? So look, when I went through the case in red, I just noted the things that sort of made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, okay? And now maybe for you, they don't, that you think these are normal or they're not that disturbing. I have a problem, I should get help at why I don't have better anger management. But you can see the list here, but I just stopped. $40 million limited progress. That's where Krishna started us. Consortium members keeping data to themselves. That's what Lee mentioned. Using shared tissue, but keeping the findings. No incentives, again, came up. Data spread out all over. You can read the list. So I guess sort of two questions. One is, should I be disturbed about these things? And if you say, well, maybe, maybe not, but that's sort of the way things are, then the question becomes, if that's the way things are, is that acceptable? And then why we're doing the case, does the Answer Fund sort of get at these underlying issues? Lincoln, you've been coming in and out here that you want to talk, so I'm going to call on you anyway.
Can you hear me?
Can we hear you? Speak up.
Yeah.
Oh, we got you.
I think, as I read this case, like everyone else, I was a little, it's too bad that such terrific data sets are generated and their use is minimal. But I also don't think it's surprising. We've seen this before. If you look at completion of the Human Genome Project, it didn't have an immediate impact, and I think we weren't that good at using the data. Another example is a database called TCGA, which is the Cancer Genome Atlas. I think when that initially was developed, we weren't that good at using it. So I think this is nothing more than a commentary on the fact that we, as a research apparatus in this country and internationally, have not had access to these kinds of large population-level databases that include genomic data for very many years. And I think we have not yet developed the enough research muscle to be able to figure out how to handle this and ask the right questions. You know, I always ask people, we constantly hear complaints that we need more data, we want more data. And I love to jokingly ask, well, if you had all the data in the world at your fingertips tomorrow in whatever discipline you want, what would you do with it? And there's always a pause. And it's because no one's ever been in a scenario where they have all the data. So we spent all of our time focusing on getting the data first. And I think we're going to, for time, develop the research muscle, now utilize this data in a way that we can have
the analytic muscle. You're referring to the analytic muscle, Lincoln.
Yes.
I get, and it's interesting, just as a commentary, because I was on a call just yesterday. You know, we've got our archipelago. There are other countries that are more centralized, if I can even say the word single payer systems, where they will be creating large centralized data sets. So Lord knows where these might come from. Marty, you were trying to get in before. I'll get you, and then I want to ask a poll question. Go ahead.
Well, you can ask the poll question first. I have a point on to Lincoln.
Go ahead, respond to Lincoln.
All the data in the world. Respond to Lincoln. Lincoln, if I had all the data in the world, it wouldn't be enough, is my question, because there's not enough patients to give you the data to address the dimensionality of the space you're trying to search. And this is something that I don't think that the medical community understands, because you know, if you know, Kathy's concerned about the fact that she has 10 new drugs and 10 indications over the last 10 years. And the question is, you know, if you ask me what the interesting question to ask is, I'll ask, you know, what's the optimal regimen for using the things we already have?
You're breaking up a little, Marty, for some reason. Lincoln, did you want to respond to that at all, or is it, let it go?
Yeah, I think the medical community understands this as well as anyone. Given the right analytical capabilities, we'll be able to answer those questions. I mean, the question that Mark started asking before it broke up is a good question, but we don't have the right analytical tools to answer that with the data we have. We haven't figured out, in my opinion, how to utilize these population level databases, but we're getting there, and we will get there. And I wouldn't be discouraged as MMRF or anybody else that these terrific databases that were put together are not immediately revealing the answers we're searching for. It will come. I think our responsibility is to continue to develop these enormous databases, because we know from previous experience that having enormous databases will provide the answers, but there's a lag between generating those tools and getting the answers we're seeking.
Okay, so let me just ask it this way. The question is, left to its own devices, is what you're describing going to happen fast enough, okay? Or does it need some outside energy to move it forward faster, okay? So consider that is the question. If they could put up my poll question, please. Can you get the poll question up? Hello? Is it up now?
It's up. They're seeing it.
Okay, you're seeing the poll question. So the poll question asks you, in your view, having read about the Answer Fund, knowing that, you know, that's getting off the ground, but they've put a significant amount of money into it. In your view, how effectively does it address the issues that we've raised? And I believe that 5 is the highest score we have it, right? Very effectively. Then 4, and if you think that like it's irrelevant for the questions, I think that's like a 1, okay? Can everyone get the poll thing on their computer? And just give me your answer to it. I can see your answers here on the screen. So if everyone would vote now, I really appreciate it. Okay, so can we hold it there and just close it? Who are those who said very effectively? Could you press your button? Brad, go ahead.
Yeah, I just put forward those proposition that the original Compass study was intended to be hypothesis generating. It wasn't powered to, say, answer a clinical question. And I think if you look at the RFA for the Answer Fund, the result there again was identification of new targets for high-risk patients. Again, hypothesis generation. So perhaps we're focusing or holding this to a different standard than what it was originally intended.
So you're saying effective for the questions it was supposed to answer. Were there features, just if we stick with the Answer Fund, were there features of the Answer Fund, or are there features that particularly appealed to you? And this is really to anyone, as you read about it, say, that's cool. Rebecca?
Yes. What really appealed to me was the way that the Answer Fund incentivized the research community and the experts to work together across the institutional silos to bring other, not just the Compass data set, but another data set into the equation, and then also to really bring the patient voice, which is often really not taken into account into shaping the questions for research. And so that really appealed to me, that kind of two-pronged patient and expert approach.
So if you go back to what problems are we trying to solve? We have the incentive problem. You're saying $1 million grants may help on that. And then we have the data archipelago, the requirement that you be merging more than one data set and hopefully more than one academic center. Any other positive features anyone wanted to underscore as you were reading this? I'm looking for a hand. Amitabh.
So, Richard, I like the emphasis on trying to figure out what worked when it came to maintenance therapy. My guess is, this is a different enterprise than trying to validate a biomarker that predicts high risk. This is saying to patients, or at least this is how I read it, we're trying a lot of different things on you. What's working for you? What isn't working for you? And my guess is we don't do enough research on sort of just improving standard of care. So I read that part of the case maybe with a little imagination, but I thought that part of the case was really exciting and thought that it had implications that went well beyond this disease.
Amitabh, why wouldn't that question get raised if they hadn't gone to they sourced this question from the crowd, one, and two, they're out, they're initiating this. Are you saying this isn't sort of a natural question for researchers to ask?
Yeah, it's not. I mean, the incentives for me are to find new biomarkers. The incentives for me are to, work with a large biotech or pharma company on bringing a new drug to market, not really figuring out how to take the old therapies of the 80s and 90s and figure out how I can make them work better in a particular patient.
And in this case, are they even necessary to take? So there's no way pharma is going to finance a study like that. Lee, you're from the payer community, at least for a major part of your life. Any comments on this? Is this, please?
Yeah, I think it was in the case that pharma would have no reason to do research to limit their market. And as much as we would like to do that, there isn't a funding mechanism within the regulatory environment of payers to fund what I'll call cost-effectiveness research. The monies that we have to use for administration are now federally limited, and they're regulated. So there isn't a good mechanism in the payer community today to help with this.
And this would be an example of being able to break through that question. And interestingly, in the crowdsourcing of this, it's not that the patients put this down because they were worried whether you were having to reimburse for too much. That's probably they're worried about side effects and exactly. How is this going to affect my life? Does it extend my life? Is it worth, is the pain worth the gain and so on? But it has that use. Mark, you've been trying to get in.
extend on this point. I think the idea of recognizing where there's clinical equipoise, where clinicians essentially have a coin flip, do I do something or not do something, are great opportunities for resources like this and for relatively small investments for many of the reasons that have already been articulated, but also because a relatively small effect size can actually have a major impact, and so it lends itself to this. But I think I want to pull back just a bit and go back to the very first question that you asked when we started, which is why do we have this? And the thing that kind of shocks me in the discussion so far is that, to me, the major reason that we have this is to try and improve the outcomes of people with multiple myeloma, and no one's articulated that yet. And this is a great question, because this is the question that the patients are asking. Do I need this therapy or do I not need this therapy? And I think a lot of the problems that we've been discussing are symptoms of a mismatch between the expectations of the people that set up the fund and what other people are thinking, like Brad was mentioning, well, it's for hypothesis generation. Well, I don't think the people that set up the fund, that was their primary reason. So that, to me, I think is really interesting. It also relates to the donors, because the donors are going to have, as different stakeholders, different perspectives. And unless we account for those sorts of things, we will end up in exactly this situation.
At this next board meeting, and of course, this is early stages of this, but, again, back to where we were with Krishna when we started, the $5 million from this comes from people writing checks. And maybe some of the same people who wrote the checks for the $40 million. Rebecca, you think you can do a good job with the board presentation on this?
Oh.
Sorry, that's what I do for a living. I surprise people with questions. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Will you repeat the question?
Okay, very good. So the case posits that Paul Giusti is going to have to give an update on this.
Yes.
Should he be sweating that, or it's not going to be that hard to?
I think, framing it for the board in terms of, what was accomplished will be, very, something that he should be thinking about thoughtfully, but maybe not sweating it.
Brian?
I just wanted to make a comment before about kind of answering the questions that patients want to see. I would say that, from my perspective, when I used to do a lot of more clinical research, those are the kind of questions we asked all the time, and we tried to find databases or do things that would help us make those, understand whether patients needed to be on treatment or not. I think my brief point is I don't think I would look at a database like this and see that question was necessarily that answerable. Ideally, I'd want to have a randomized discontinuation design or something like that. And I would try to maybe make some inferences based on a big database. But, understanding who needs to be on a therapy and who doesn't in a patient population that, what didn't have an intervention kind of either randomly assigned or randomly discontinued might be hard to make those inferences. And I think we could think about ways to combine this data set with like prospective data. But I think one of the reasons that question wouldn't come up to me to kind of interrogate this database is not because I'm not thinking about what's important to patients, but because I just wouldn't have thought that this database was ideal to answer that.
Gotcha. Stuart?
I sort of disagree with that a little bit in that real-world databases have the ability to see what's happening in clinical practice every day in our, among patients, and to help us sort out what's working and what's not working. So I think that, they aren't a replacement for the randomized clinical trials, but for this type of question, like is maintenance worth it or not, where we know that some doctors are doing it, some doctors are not doing it, this is the type of thing that a big real-world database can answer. And I think that the answer from picking this little question, and I say little, and I really little, it may be a quick win. I don't think that's why Compass was developed, though, to have this be the final product. I mean, there's a lot more in Compass, a lot more that genomics, a lot more that can come out. But I think that if Paul's going to have to defend the spend of money, it's nice to get a couple quick wins on the board, and this might be a quick win.
Okay. Let me just, if they could put up the next poll question, and we'll do two of these. The issues, it seems to me, that the Answer Fund is addressing. One is, how do you get the right question asked? Okay? And we've seen crowdsourcing approaches. We've seen going to the experts. We've certainly seen a lot of refinement of the question. So how do you get the right question asked? The second is, how do you amass enough data? And going on the assumption, which I think is a fair one, that as great as Compass is, there still isn't enough data there. And maybe, Marty, to your point, there'll never be enough data. And third, what's the best way to get it analyzed? Lincoln says that's only going to get better, but how do you choose? We have to deal in the here and now. So the first poll question, I believe, asks, what's the most important of those three? And I understand those are all good things. Aggregating the data, I have one, asking the right question. 2, aggregating the data. 3, finding the appropriate way to analyze it. And I know all 3 of these are important, but just vote quickly because I've asked the question and you have a responsibility to answer it. Go ahead, please.
Now, right?
Yeah, right now. I'm just.
Okay.
Yeah, you can you? Is it possible to vote, Lee? Have you voted?
Yes.
Interesting by far. Why don't we stop this now? You can see that my glasses. Half of you say asking the right question. About 40% say aggregating it, and 10% say the data. How did you vote, Lee?
Well, I was aggregating the data.
Okay, please.
I think we don't always know what the right question is until we start sifting through that data.
Okay, who said asking the right question? That has to be half of you. So, Ravi.
Yes, can you hear me?
I think so. Keep talking. We'll hear you.
Okay. Yeah, it's a chicken and egg situation. I said ask the right question given the amount of time that's already been spent on this. And one of the things that I really liked was the effort that the team had put forward in engaging, specific data scientists or whatever else to start to sift through the data. I think if you start with asking the right question, then you can aggregate all the data later on and bolster your investigation.
Got it. Sudhir, you want to comment on this?
Yeah.
How did you vote, by the way?
I voted for asking the right question, but I was a little torn. With all due respect, I think there was a number 4 that was missing because what we're hearing is that questions and the data are inextricably linked, and the questions really have to drive the design of the study, the design of the data aggregation platform, the targeted data, the size of the data. So I think the most important thing is aligning what was previously 1 and 2 from the get-go.
Gotcha. Let me put up the last poll question because I want to get to Paul here. And it's the same question, but the first said, what's the most important? This asks, what's the most difficult to accomplish? They may not necessarily be the same thing. What's the hardest to do here? Asking the right question, aggregating the data, or finding the right analytics for it. Please vote again now. You can see I like to poll. I should have gone and become a political pollster. Okay, this is exactly what I thought it would be. Overwhelming that in spite of what may be the most important, the most difficult is aggregating the data. Shocking to you, Lincoln?
Not at all, no. The current owners of most of this data are, healthcare systems and maybe some payers, but institutions have been conditioned for 3 decades to believe that their data is valuable and that they can monetize it at some point. And so a lot of the decision makers feel like sharing their data is essentially sharing the downstream revenue that they theoretically believe is going to come to them magically somehow. And we've got to get away from that thinking. It's just not true. So, and I want to say on the previous point that aggregating data is still the right thing to continue to do. It's not only the hardest thing to do, but we've got to continue to do it. It's the most important thing, and we've learned from our past successes. If you look at the absolute home run of immunotherapy and cancer, it only was made possible because of the 2 decades of data that's been generated by the NIH's investment in basic science research. So, and the same is true of precision medicine, the Human Genome Project. It was only after we invested significantly in generating enormous amounts of data that we have in the last 5 years made these enormous strides in targeted therapy, precision medicine, and immuno-oncology. And you can't do that. It doesn't matter what question you ask. If you don't have all of the data needed to answer that question, your right question will never matter.
Gotcha. So listen, I want to get to Paul, and we have a bunch of other things to do. I'm thrilled with how many red lights I've seen and people's participation. And I know Chris and Steve, you had your hands up, so to speak. I see it as a red light. But Paul, why don't you come up and comment then?